Hello again, and welcome back to Educator.com's Introduction to PHP course. In today's lesson, we're going to be talking about user-defined functions with variable length parameter lists. So specifically, we're going to be talking about what variable length parameter lists are and how you can define functions that have variable length parameter lists. And then we're also going to talk about some built-in functions to PHP that relate to finding out the types of different variables. And that's something that is often used with variable length parameter list functions. So user-defined functions in PHP are permitted to accept any number of parameters. The functions we've worked with before have had required parameters and optional parameters. But all of those are explicitly listed in the function's definition. In a variable length parameter list function, you can supply arguments or parameters to the function that aren't even defined in the list, whether required or optional. PHP provides a couple of built-in functions for being able to deal with these types of functions, and they're only in user-defined functions. There's one called funcnum_args, which basically is a function that returns the number of arguments that were input to a particular function. Function getArg, which allows you to get the value of a particular argument that was passed in, and then function getArgs, which basically returns an index array of all of the function arguments that were passed to a particular user-defined function. Now, one thing to note is that these functions interpret the argument list as being zero indexed, just like an array, meaning that they treat the first argument as being argument 0 rather than argument 1. So it works kind of just like arrays. So if we take a look at a file called variableparams.php, I've created a function here called add, and as you can see, it has no defined parameters, it has no parameter list. But in fact, it actually can accept multiple parameters. And what this function does is it takes as many integer parameters you provide, or numeric parameters you provide to it. It's just going to add them all up, however many you provide, and then return the sum. So for example, here we call the function add1, which means we're providing the one argument to it, and it's the number 1. So what's going to happen is when we enter the function, we set up a sum variable, which we just set equal to 0. And then what we do is we use a for loop to loop over all of the arguments provided to the function. So we set I equal to 0, which is our counter. And then we say as long as I is less than the number of arguments, go ahead and evaluate the loop. And the loop evaluates by just cumulatively adding each parameter to the value of each parameter to this sum variable. And the way it does that is, you can see here we've made use of the built-in function getArg, and what we do is we pass it the number of the argument that we want to get, and in this case, for the first time through this loop, it's going to be 0, and that's because, as mentioned, in an argument list, the first argument is considered by these functions to be 0. So this is going to say the first time this loop goes through, it's going to say get me the argument at index 0, which is going to be the first argument, and add it to the sum. It's going to do that for each of these arguments. Once it reaches the end of the number of arguments that we have, or it's looped over all of the arguments, it's going to exit. In this case, it's only going to loop through one time because we've only provided one variable to it. So it's going to be 0. Then when the loop finishes, it's going to increment to 1, and 1 is not going to be less than 1, which is the number of arguments, so it will end. So if we run this function, run this script, we can see that sum equals 1 when we pass it one parameter with the value 1. Now let's say we want to add multiple numbers, 1, 2, and 3. Now again, this function doesn't have a specified parameter list. It says it accepts 3 functions, but it has the built-in capability using these built-in functions from PHP, the funcnum_args and function getArg, to be able to add up all of these together. So the result should be 6, and when we reload our page, we can see that that's the result. And you can sort of do that indefinitely. You can add as many arguments as you want. If we add a 4 and a 5, it should sum up to 15. And as we see, that's going to be the case. The other thing to notice is that actually if we don't provide it any arguments, that's still going to work. When we enter it, sum's going to be equal to 0. We're going to set the counter equal to 0, and we're going to say as long as I is less than the number of function arguments, we're going to execute the loop. Well, the number of function arguments is 0, 0 is not less than 0, so this is never going to get executed, so it's just going to return the sum, which is going to be the default value, or its initial value, which is 0. So when we run this, we should get sum equals 0. And so that's an example of you don't actually even have to pass parameters to functions that accept variable length parameters, parameter list. As far as variable length parameter lists go, you can also use supply a variable number of arguments to a function that actually has a defined parameter list. So like the functions we've worked with before where we have required or optional parameters, you can also supply additional parameters on top of that, additional basically function arguments. And then the thing to note is that for those arguments that you've actually already defined parameters for example, let's say we call the first one required 1, the second one required 2, you can access those parameter values, or the values passed in for those parameters when you call the function via the variable names that you give them. So for example, required 1 or required 2, or you can access them via the built-in functions for dealing with variable length parameter lists. So for example, even though the first parameter might be called required 1 in our function definition, we can also access that with the function getArg with the value 0, because that's going to say give me the value of the first argument. So let's take a look at how this works in a script called variable params2. And here we've just kind of updated the function add, and we've actually had it so that it requires 2 arguments. It requires an op1 and an op2, and basically what it does is it takes those 2 arguments and adds them together. Then it provides the additional functionality that you can supply to any other number of arguments, and it's going to add that to the total of op1 and op2. But these first 2 arguments are required, and if you don't supply them to the function, you're going to get an error from PHP. Now, as you can see here, one thing to note is that when we loop over all of the extra, quote-unquote, extra arguments provided to the function, all of those variable length parameters, we actually start our loop counter at 2. Because if we started at 0, it would, because we've already added op1 and op2 to each other, if we started at 0, it would re-add them again and our sum would be incorrect. So here we actually started at 2 and says I want to add in addition to op1 and op2 any additional arguments from the third argument on. So for example, if we pass it the 2 required parameters, 100 and 1, we should get the sum 101. If we load the page, that's actually what we get. Now if we were to call it, for example, with just 1 parameter, because they're listed as a required parameter, we're going to get a warning from PHP. And it's going to say missing argument 2 for add. So let's go back and correct that. And now let's add some additional arguments, 2, 3, 4, which should give us the sum 110. And so when we go and reload the page, we should see that our sum equals 110. And so the thing to note here is that the first 2 arguments are added up by accessing them using their defined names, their defined parameter names, op1 and op2, which were defined in the function definition. But as mentioned on the slide, you can actually access them using this function getArg, the function getArg as well. So actually, we could actually cancel this out here. And even though these are defined parameters, we don't actually have to access them using their variable names given. We can set sum equal to 1 and have the content of this loop be the same as it was before, as in add with no parameters, no required parameters. Here we have 2 required parameters, but it's still going to work with the same code even though we're not accessing op1 and op2 using those variable names. And so when we run this function again, it's still going to give us 110. And we can see that when it reloads, that's exactly what happens. And just make sure, let's remove couple of these parameters, so we get 103. So you can see that the function still works. So they're actually for parameters that are defined, you can actually access them using the function getArg function, or you can access them directly by calling them by their variable name that you define in the parameter list.